yeah, so just more parents need to understand. And
I really think that that's going to be kind of the beginning of the catalyst for change, is just presenting the process, like solving individual problems. Like when we were talking about developmental delay. Okay, that's a little nugget. We can talk about this and, get you ready for this specific meeting. But also, it's important that everybody just knows the process and everybody just knows the acronyms that are out there and the terms. And to understand this is what developmental delay is. This is just kind of the catch-all diagnosis that they'll give kids early on. And if you haven't closed that gap with developmental delay by the time you're 9, then it's not developmental delay. It's something else.
yeah.
And that's why we change eligibility categories. Like,
Well, and I think and this is the part that I'm still learning, the eligibility categories and how that works. But I think that a lot of parents assume that we don't really have a choice in it, that they're going to do this evaluation and this is what they're going to test for. Where, I'm very adamant that Stella doesn't get an IQ test, because there's no way that it's going to, with her, especially with her being nonverbal, an IQ test is not going to represent really what she actually
it's not going to be valid. Yeah.
Right. So, but knowing that I could say no IQ test was important, because I think that, parents don't always know that they can say no to something, and so, we are going for OHI is what we're testing for, which I had heard was difficult to, that I would have a difficult time getting that eligibility, but it seems like our psychologist was on board. So
I think in a lot of ways, OHI is difficult because that usually encompasses, so she does have a medical diagnosis. Now, her medical diagnosis also comes with educational deficits. Right. So you could come in with CP, and maybe that comes in with like physical disabilities. It's hard to navigate the school, but we don't really have cognitive deficits there. So now that's where parents come in and they're like, okay, this is my kid. See, we've got forearm crutches or a wheelchair. So here we are. And then schools are kind of like, well, yeah, except you can get down the hallway. You can, we'll do adaptive PE. So you can get that. You can navigate the cafeteria and get on and off the bus. And so, yes, you have this medical diagnosis, but no, it doesn't really affect your education right now. So then that's where it becomes hard for OHI sometimes, or these kids with ADHD that you're going to the pediatrician, you're getting diagnosed at the pediatrician's office, which may be an entirely different conversation to have. Or, you're going to a psychologist, psychiatrist, you're getting diagnosed with ADHD. Nobody's going to argue that medical diagnosis, but what the school's job is to say, okay, how does this diagnosis affect your education? And sometimes they say it just doesn't. So ADHD is lumped into that OHI, and that's where school's like, okay, we'll test you for this. But also, we happen to be a small school with a small class, and so it doesn't really affect your education. Or in some ways, I don't perceive your hyperactive behavior or your inattentive behavior to be negatively impacting your education. And that's the psychologist's perception or the teacher's perception. And that's what you're going on there.
So I guess I'm still confused I'm still confused, honestly, to what the best option is for Stella. It sounded like without doing an IQ test, OHI was the best, thing to go for. But what does that change as far as her education if we, is that really going to change anything? And can any of those categories affect her placement?
No. So then there's her placement. If you think about least restrictive environment and placement in the IEP, that's not necessarily her seat in the classroom. That's just her placement on a roster and her placement with a case manager. So her placement is, the general ed classroom with lots of support from a special ed teacher. So she has a special ed case manager who is responsible for the modifying the curriculum, supporting the gen ed teacher and doing that. That's the person that's going to come in and co-teach to really help break down that lesson into something that Stella can understand and she can learn. So that's where the placement is. And the least restrictive environment is like the percentage of the time that you're going to be in special ed versus gen ed, and then gen ed with these special ed supports. So she is still who she is, and her needs are still what they are. So an eligibility category doesn't necessarily say, so I'm going to say this and then I'll say something else. It doesn't necessarily say, oh, because OHI, you can't have cognitive goals now. You can't have academic goals, because you absolutely can. You don't have to have an IQ test to have academic goals, because we're not saying that's not the bar that we're raising. The bar that we're raising is identifying letters and numbers, putting them together to make words, doing single digit addition, following one-step directions. Like, that's what we're working on, no matter what her eligibility category is. That being said, these parents that are looking at specific learning disabilities, that's kind of a different category. If you have a specific learning disability in math, your goals are math-based goals. That's where it's very important. So, because you're not going to get a reading and writing goal when your eligibility is specific learning disability in math.
Okay.
And nobody's going to argue that. That makes sense. Where you have a learning difference here, we've identified it. Now, have we looked at all the areas to make sure we captured all the areas? That's really important. But as far as like OHI versus mild mental disability or functional mental disability, which is kind of where those alternate assessment kids are, self-contained classroom kids are, that's based on an IQ and performance. So if you're not doing the IQ test, then it's hard to qualify for those categories. So that's probably why it was easier to get OHI eligibility, or at least to get them to consent to test for OHI.
Yeah.
And within that, there are cognitive deficits that come with Down syndrome, and nobody's arguing that. So you're going to get OHI dash Down syndrome, and that's fine. Also, we understand with that, this comes some fine motor coordination, some attention, some cognitive. We're addressing all of these things.